want to begin with a review. We covered a lot of information yesterday, and especially when it's given in Catholic Vatican-style language, it can be hard to get to the point. So I just want to review what we covered yesterday to begin with. Probably going back more to the beginning. I'll erase this off the board if we're comfortable with that. When we lined up with the history of Christ and our own history, and we didn't place the counterfeit, but that was the thought that we had. In history of success, you see both leaders at the time of the end, the first and the second angel, Christ and John, Parminder and Jeff. The second arrives at the waymark of baptism, or 2001, and they become more visible, but they are not yet leading the movement until you have Christ come out of the wilderness, after the marriage of Cana, finally at the first temple cleansing, around the time of the imprisonment of John, lining that up with 2014. So that was the whole point of lining those two histories up, was to show why when we come to the time of the end for modern Babylon, we see both leaders at the same point in time. Just to give a little bit of history, it's possibly oversimplified version, but around the time of the Second Vatican Council, you had in the 1860s, late 1860s, early 1870s, you had much of Latin America engulfed in civil war. So the southern countries of America were going through some extremely difficult political time. Thousands of people disappeared or were killed. You had militia governments, fights, war really between capitalist-style dictatorships propped up by the United States and these more socialistic, communistic parties. And the Catholic Church in the southern in the southern countries of America, Latin America, began to become quite political in this history of civil war, particularly in one country, El Salvador. So the Catholic Church in that country, the priests and bishops, they started becoming concerned about the plight of all of the poor people who in this history of civil war were suffering most acutely. They began to promote the needs of the poor and the working class. And this essentially is what drew them to a type of Catholic doctrine that was equivalent, or the religious equivalent, to socialism. So the Catholic Church in those countries, much of them started to become political, leaning towards this new type of theology that was developing, that the Catholic Church needed to be involved in taking care of those who were struggling, minority groups, the poor, all of those different areas, women. And this happened around the same time as the Second Vatican Council. It influenced the Second Vatican Council because much of the reforms are really liberalistic and socialistic in ideas. So if you were to think of that concept, this theology that was developing in Latin America, their ideas of taking care of the poor, for example, if you are a strong Catholic, you do not believe in contraception of any kind, unless it's some type of monitoring a woman's monthly cycle. Otherwise, no contraception of any kind is permitted. Abortion is just the farthest end of that. They don't approve of abortion. But before you get to abortion, before even you get pregnant, the Catholic Church does not permit any form of contraception. So you have all of these poor people in Latin America, and many of them having a great deal of children because they can't regulate their pregnancies. And in many cases, women who were struggling to support children and the fathers had left home, would only come home occasionally, would sleep with her, get her pregnant, and then leave her with a new baby to care for, or many cases, as the Civil War progressed, of mass rape. And these women were bearing the load of raising families and children. So when this Catholic Church starts to care about their plight, they start thinking, we need to be able to give these women contraceptives, because this constantly producing children is creating a burden on their life. So it naturally, these liberation theology, which is what it becomes known as, it really does become liberal in its mindset because it's caring about the people. Contraception is just one example of that. Trying to meet the needs of the people. And when they tried to meet the needs of the people, it regularly goes against Catholic theology. So in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s particularly, this theology developed in wartime known as liberation theology. It was particularly taken up by the Jesuits. Just quoting here, for Latin America's bloodthirsty cold warriors, liberation theology was a synonym for communism. So the capitalist-style dictatorships, some of which were being armed and propped up by the United States, they began to turn on the Catholic Church, and many Catholics died, Catholics who believed in this liberation theology. They were killed by the government for promoting this liberation theology because it was seen as political. And particularly in El Salvador, the government militias would shout a phrase, be a patriot, kill a priest. So that was their mindset towards Catholicism through this history. If you want to be patriotic, be a patriot, kill a priest. Because it was the priests, the Catholic Church, that were promoting socialism in Latin America. I want to come back to 1979. 1979, where does John Paul go? He goes to the United States, to Washington. We remember that, right? He also goes somewhere else. In 1979, he visits South America, and he goes to Mexico. He attracts the largest crowd in history, estimated at 5 million people, showing that he had a political influence to reckon with. And he used his power to denounce liberation theology. So John Paul grows up in Poland. He's an extreme conservative. His mother dies, I think, when he's about 8 years old. And if you want to break down his psychology, he has a bit of an issue with women. His mother was extremely sick. He lost her when he was 8 years old. He turned to Mary, but this is the problem with the Catholic Church. They mask their sexism with Mary, as if they look up to Mary because they're looking up to this mother. But when he looks up to Mary, it's such veiled but extreme sexism. A woman has worth as long as she's a virgin, as long as she's this lifted up as this pure, glowing, holy thing. Not for her mind, not for her actions, only a pure womb. That's how the Catholic Church views a woman. So his mother dies when he's 8 years old. I think it was 8. And he turns in an extreme way to the Catholic Church and to Mary, and is extremely conservative. So as he is trying to see the downfall of communism, he has all of these troublesome Jesuits, particularly Latin America, promoting socialism and this liberation theology. In Mexico in 1979, he attracts a crowd of 5 million people and starts to publicly denounce this liberation theology. He says, when they begin to use political means, they cease to be theologians. Can we sense John Paul's hypocrisy? Was he political? Yes, he was political. But when these priests are going against his political ideals, promoting what is really quite liberalism, he begins to accuse them of using political means. He has a particular issue with women, quoting, "Women were the thorn in John Paul's side. Their challenge pains him more than pains. At this point, their demands and criticism enrage him. Yet the searing controversies surrounding birth control, divorce, and the ordination of women are not going to disappear. The revolution in women's rights is ongoing. John Paul II's opposition to it is fixed, his rigidity is well known. As his line has hardened, his temper has flared. In 1985, he met with the Undersecretary of the United Nations. Her name was Nafis Sadiq. The Undersecretary of the United Nations on Population and Development. She met with him privately at the Vatican, and they began to have this veiled disagreement about the role of abortion in developing countries. She insisted that the matter had to be addressed. Domestic violence was rising, and women were often becoming pregnant unwillingly. John Paul burst out angrily. "Don't you think that the irresponsible behaviour of men is caused by women?" Perhaps such a view is not surprising in a Polish patriarch of the Pope's generation. So this article, it begins to break down his mentality. It's extremely sexist, extremely not liberation theology, put it that way, extremely conservative. So in 1979, he travels to South America and denounces this liberation theology that's been rising up over the last 10 years. A couple of years later, in 1981, he directly takes on the Jesuits. The Jesuits have been fairly independent to the Vatican. They've been quite strong-willed, and despite opposition, they've been promoting this liberation theology. In 1981, the head of the Jesuit order, I don't think he died, I think he had a stroke. He wasn't able to continue as head of the Jesuit order. Until this time, it was known that the Jesuits, they were the head of the Jesuit order is known as the Black Pope, if you've heard that term, because he's the second highest in command in the Catholic Church. It goes Pope, head of the Jesuit order. That's the hierarchy. That Black Pope could no longer fulfill his job function, and the Jesuit order elected his successor, as is always the practice. Quoting from Time magazine, 1981, "John Paul has entered a high-stakes game. The Jesuits are the largest and the most dominant of the men's orders, 27,000 of them, far-flung influence in education, theology and missions. Their general, the head of the Jesuit order, is considered the second most powerful figure in Roman Catholicism. John Paul II, no stranger to controversy, last week took a bold step to bridle the Society of Jesus. In a move interpreted as a warning to all religious orders, he suspended the normal workings of the Jesuit constitution, removed the acting leader of the organization, and replaced him with 2 Italian Jesuits who were conservatives and essentially acted as puppet leaders. Pontiffs have intervened in the past by dictating the elections of Superior General, head of the Jesuit order. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV even dissolved the society, a 41-year-long humiliation that some Jesuit intellectuals close to the Vatican are comparing with John Paul's treatment." So all through his rise, and then finally when he became Pope in 1978, then in 1979 when he goes to Mexico, he's denouncing this liberation theology. 1981, he begins to take control of the Jesuit order, and he forces them into submission. He removes the leaders and puts in puppet leaders, and they're supposed to elect their own leadership. And the Jesuits close to the Vatican start to compare John Paul II and what he's done to the Jesuit order with the abolishing in 1773. So there's this war, and we've alluded to that. This is just a little bit more detail. We've alluded to this civil war inside the papacy in this time period. When in 1989, in this history, you had John Paul II versus the Jesuits. It had been developing in the history previously. In 1989, we could come back to El Salvador. El Salvador was in civil war. It was one of the areas that was promoting this liberation theology. In 1989, troops belonging to El Salvador, troops that had been American trained, killed 6 Jesuit priests. This was a response to what those Jesuits to the liberation theology those Jesuits had been preaching. So the government, members of the government's militia, attacked the Catholic Church and killed 6 leading Jesuit priests. This caused such an outrage it led to the end of the civil war in El Salvador. In 2019, this is a New York Times article from 2019, takes us back to 1989, the killing of the Jesuit priests in El Salvador, the political impacts of that, and then it speaks about how 2019 Pope Francis, the first Jesuit Pope, visited Central America and hailed the Jesuits working in Central America as pioneers in the struggle for social justice. So what does that tell you about Pope Francis's position on liberation theology? He said they were pioneers in the struggle for social justice. So John Paul condemns them. Malachi Martin called them the betrayers of the Catholic Church. Pope Francis calls them the pioneers for social justice. So we go into this history of 1989 and we see John Paul II and the Jesuits. They're in this civil war and they're half right and half wrong. John Paul is the leader, just as Butler was the leader. He's right on one thing. He's right on the need to overthrow the Soviet Union. But the Jesuits are right on liberation theology. The changes of the Second Vatican Council, which we lined up with 1863. This was organisation. This was organisation. Yes?
When you were saying that they killed the 6 Jesuit priests, what did this spark? Did this spark a civil war? Is that what you're saying?
No, the Civil War was ongoing. It was a major catalyst in the end of the war because people were, the international outcry, the killing of Catholic priests, it forced people to negotiate peace. So we know John Paul's position on liberation theology. We line that up with 1888, the leadership opposing this radical new faction with seemingly new doctrine, lining that up with Butler, the leadership opposing Wagner and their supposed radical new doctrine. We find that both had elements that were correct and incorrect. John Paul II is the leader who's doing a good work, but he's rejecting this new theology. Butler rejected justification by faith. John Paul II rejected liberation theology. We lined those two up, and then if that's 1888, the next waymark on our reform line is the time of the end, 1989. We lined that up with 2001, and that's when we see a new leadership raised. In our history, it's the time of the end, so how many do we have? 2. Both arrive at the same time, first and second angel, Elder Jeff and Elder Parminder. Compared and contrast that, we saw in 2001 the rise of Ratzinger, who's going to be the first angel, and then Bergoglio, who will become the second. I just want to mention Ratzinger's position on liberation theology. He is the most prolific theologian the Catholic Church has had in 100 years. But his position on liberation theology was not favourable. It was in line with John Paul II. He said liberation theology was a singular heresy. He blasted the new movement as a fundamental threat to the Church and prohibited some of its leading proponents from speaking publicly. In an effort to clean house, Ratzinger even summoned outspoken priests to Rome and censured them on grounds that they were abandoning the Church's spiritual role for inappropriate socio-economic activism. So Ratzinger is not favourable to liberation theology. He calls it a singular heresy and a fundamental threat. So he's not going to take on this liberation theology. Instead, in 2001, he's going to take on the sexual abuse crisis, the greatest crisis since the Protestant Reformation. In 2001, he takes over all of those cases worldwide, and he begins to clean up, in his own words, the filth inside the Catholic Church. At the same point in time, we have Bergoglio, and he becomes a cardinal. He meets some of those radical liberation theology believing cardinals that had formed the top secret St. Galen group. Under Ratzinger and John Paul II, they had pretty much gone into hiding because they would get censured, sometimes excommunicated. So this secret group, St. Galen's group, that were of this bent towards liberation theology, they formed this top secret group and started planning how they would overturn the Catholic leadership and bring in a pope who believed in this type of liberalism. They meet Bergoglio in 2001 when he becomes cardinal. It's also worth noting that in 2001, he had been relatively unknown. Bergoglio does this act in South America where he visits victims of HIV/AIDS and he kisses and washes the feet of AIDS patients. This has become a major part of his, you could say, cult of personality. Every time people think that he's bad or he's done something wrong, people say, well, in 2001, he washed the feet of AIDS patients. It became quite famous. So you begin to see him recognized. We mark up here the arrival of the second angel. In 2005, we see the arrival of Bergoglio. In 2001, we mark the death or the bypassing, you could just call it death of leadership. In 2005, we mark the death of leadership. It wasn't just John Paul that died in 2005. Who else died? Lucia. So you mark the death. It wasn't just of their leadership. It was John Paul. It was also Lucia. They both died in 2005. You have the death of leadership, and then at this conclave being the meeting where they elect a new pope, you have Bergoglio come in second. So he is for the first time internationally recognized. We see Ratzinger become Pope Benedict. But we also have Bergoglio coming in second place. In his history, we mark Elder Jeff. He's still the leader, but then in 2012, we have this crisis in the movement of time setting. He's on the wrong side of that crisis. 2005 to 2012, Pope Benedict is Pope, but he's losing this struggle to clean out the papacy, the Vatican particularly. In 2012, there is this scandal, the VatiLeaks scandal. Demonstrates his failure to clean out particularly not just the issues of immorality, but the financial misdoings. 2014, we mark a transition in leadership from Elder Jeff to Elder Parminda, from the first angel to the second angel. 2012, because of this scandal, Benedict steps down, first pope in 600 years, and we have the introduction of Bergoglio. He finally comes in. So this is the empowerment of the second angel, the empowerment of the second angel. We're all okay so far? Any questions or thoughts? Immediately, Pope Francis begins to make a storm. In 2013, someone asks him about homosexuality in the church, and he says, if someone is gay and he searches for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge? This causes a storm within the Catholic Church. It's not the normal Catholic response to homosexuality. People become more concerned than ever before about the direction he's going to take the Catholic Church in. And then in 2013, just after becoming Pope, he announces that in 2014 there's going to be an extraordinary synod, extraordinary meaning unusual or not after the normal Catholic meetings. It's not one that would have just been part of their rolling calendar. He's called a special synod on the family. And when you start talking about the family, it's all of those conservative doctrines that people have been fighting about. It's not just homosexuality, gay marriage, it's also contraception, the role of women in the family and the church, all of those different things. So he's highlighting, he's choosing that this synod on the family, this is what all of those liberation theology arguments center around. And we went through a history of that synod. There is a book written just find it. There's a book written by a man we should remember. His name is Edward Penton. And the title of the book is, he's a leading Catholic. If you were to go to EWTN, which we spoke of yesterday, you'll find him being interviewed on camera, article after article. He's a common Catholic journalist, conservative, I believe. And it's titled, The Rigging of a Vatican Synod. Do we all know what rigging means? Who wants to explain to us the meaning of rigging, in case anyone's confused by that word? Brother Willie, what does it mean to rig something? To steal? What's commonly rigged? Elections. Lack of transparency during an election? I would suggest it starts with that, but it goes further than just not transparency. Why don't you have transparency in an election? Because you're cheating. So you're trying to manipulate the outcome. Is that okay? When you rig something, you do something in secrecy because you're trying to manipulate the outcome. And this is what Edward Penton and other conservative Catholics start to accuse Francis and Francis's disciples of in 2014, that whatever Pope Francis said about not questioning Vatican Catholic theology and it being an open forum for everyone to have freedom and discuss, his words are meaningless because the actual processes by which he conducts this synod give this appearance that he's trying to manipulate the outcome of the synod. There is a prominent cardinal. He's patron of the Sovereign Military Order of the Knights of Malta. So that's quite a title. You know if he's a patron of the Sovereign Military Order of the Knights of Malta, that he's a fairly powerful cardinal. His name is Raymond Burke. He said after the synod, "It's clear to me that there were individuals who obviously had a very strong influence on the synod process who were pushing an agenda." So Cardinal Raymond Burke immediately accused the individuals at the synod of trying to manipulate it, pushing an agenda. And they are, those individuals were handpicked by Pope Francis. An anonymous Roman priest closely involved in the synod debates gave this statement anonymously: "This was a rigged synod. I call it the robber synod." This all occurred in October of 2014. One of the chief issues, we discussed it yesterday, is that the Synod Fathers, those bishops, they were divided into 10 small working groups. So there was 10 groups formed, 3 Italian, 3 English, 2 Spanish, 2 French, working in their own languages, who were to propose amendments to the report in preparation to make a final document that they would all sign off on and would be released to the world. So they were meant to organise in small groups and discuss their points and what they wanted in this final report. And they were to put their suggestions into writing. Normally, once those small groups, because this is the way every synod operates, those small groups write the report of what they believe, and then that report is meant to be written out and given to the public. It's meant to be made public. But after these working group sessions had finished, Cardinal Baldisseri announced to the participants in the Synod Hall that the reports of the groups would not be made available to the public, contrary to the practice of previous synods. Instead, a summary would be made of the group's discussions, which would then be published. All that means is if I have a view and I put it into writing, instead of my view being put into writing and distributed, someone is going to take that view, make a summary of it, however they want to word it, and then that will be published. This is what Pope Francis had done that manipulated the outcome. Because if my views are conservative, Pope Francis has liberals interpreting my views and rewording everything. So that the conservative essence of my writing gets lost. We talked yesterday about George Pell. Do we remember him? The Australian, currently in a maximum security prison. He didn't respond well to this. Eyewitnesses said that he slammed his hand on the table and insisted that people had a right to hear what the bishops were saying. So pretty much you had anarchy in front of Pope Francis in the Synod Hall. 17 bishops, cardinals, one after the other, stood up and denounced the decision to not publish the writings. There was uproar and chanting for a number of minutes. In the end, Pope Francis caved and he allowed some publishing. They called this a mini revolt. So I think we can all start to appreciate that it's not that easy being Pope. It's not that easy even for Pope Francis to go in front of all of his bishops and cardinals and say this is how we're going to conduct this meeting. They're in open revolt to his decisions. But then when it comes to the final working document that was to be released publicly, we discussed how he put those 7 liberals on the drafting committee for this document, and then finally had to bring in a conservative, and that turned into a huge civil war mess itself. There was an article I just want to find. I can't find it here now. Where am I? Of the bishops at the Synod, 41 publicly expressed concern, particularly regarding the language of homosexuality. They said there was a seismic shift in tone toward the acceptance of homosexuality. Conservatives were outraged, according to the Associated Press, about a remarkable tone of acceptance extended to gays. So they're not claiming to change Catholic theology, but they were able to really hijack the writing of the final report and change the language. So all through this, particularly 2014, but then all through this history, you have these 2 groups developing. And then we also spoke about a separate issue, REPAM. Separate to what he's doing with the Synod on the Family, they organised this REPAM conference. REPAM stands for the Red Ecclesial Pan Amazonica, which just means that it is ecclesial church. It's an Amazonian conference for the whole of the Amazon region. And it's particularly relating to the defence of human rights in all of its forms, taking care of the indigenous, the poor, etc., which is the exact line of thinking as liberation theology. We spoke about how this liberal faction had access to Francis, the conversations between that liberal faction and Francis about making bold proposals, starting to introduce married priests, women taking up roles previously forbidden to them, etc. And this, from 2014 to 2019, is a steady progression of preparation for the Amazonian Synod. And you have two different narratives developing about this. EWTN and LifeSite News. These are the two particularly conservative channels. Church Militant is extremely conservative, but really in the line of like an independent Adventist. These two, you could say conservative Adventist if you were to compare and contrast. Church Militant is entirely independent Adventist. It's extremely conservative. We talked about the beginning of the Amazonian Synod. And this is when we start to see these two sides develop. You have EWTN and NCR, National Catholic Reporter. There's another website known as National Catholic Register. It is not the same thing. It is conservative. National Catholic Reporter is separate to that, and it is liberal. So if you go to NCR, make sure it's Reporter and not Register. As the Amazonian Synod begins in the later months of 2019, around October, November, these factions really break into the open. I want to step back from that and come back to prior to that. So can we see that there's these two factions developing? Conservatives and liberals, both having a leader to look to. Normally, the leader, when there's a leadership transition, you find the first leader died. If you were to go back to the history of Moses and Joshua, when the mantle is passed to Joshua, what happens to Moses? He dies. When you come to the history of Christ and you go to John, from John to Jesus, what happens to John? He dies. When you come to 2014, there's a mantle changed, but has Elder Jeff gone anywhere? No. So people now are tested. They now have a choice between two leaders. They don't have to follow the second. They can feel comfortable following the first. So you have these two factions developing in these histories between who follows Jeff, his disciples, and who follows Parminder, his disciples. So from 14 to 19, you have these two sides develop, who follows Benedict, his disciples, and who follows Francis, his disciples. They have two leaders to choose from. And it's not happened in 600 years that you would have a leadership transition as this in the Catholic Church. Pope Benedict, is he supportive of Francis? To begin with. He says at the beginning, I'm passing the mantle, I'm going to go into hiding, but he never truly relinquishes his control. Normally, if a pope resigns, what does he become? He just becomes a layperson. He loses that title. But Benedict chooses not to do that. He wants to become pope Emeritus. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. So he chooses to keep this title of Pope. He never actually let go of his leadership. And he stays living inside the Vatican. So he could have fully relinquished his leadership authority at the very beginning. But at the very beginning, he chooses not to do that. At the same time, he's claiming to support Francis. All this history, Elder Jeff passing the mantle, did he actually properly relinquish his authority? No. In fact, from his statements most recently, we understand that what he expected Parminder to be was some type of puppet leader, to still come under his authority. Somehow that we would turn to him for direction and guidance, and he would still be the one quietly leading the movement. Never fully let go of his authority, even when he claimed to pass the mantle. So we find that both former leaders are holding on to that claim of authority. When do you find Benedict first start to cause problems for Francis? First come out in open contradiction to him? Do you all remember? It was presented before the shaking ever happened, because I wanted to give Elder Jeff a warning. He didn't listen. April 2019. In April 2019, just prior to this, Francis has been dealing with the sexual abuse crisis. And what is Francis's position on the sexual abuse crisis? Sister Solange. What does he believe is the cause? The cause. What would Francis say the cause is for the sexual abuse crisis? Inaction of leadership. It's part of it. Anyone else want to add to it?
Priests who do not have wives, maybe they can be allowed to marry.
He isn't that open, but he's starting to introduce that thought that priestly celibacy, the way that at the very least how priests, they're at a young age and they're locked off from the community. Really, they're quite emotionally underdeveloped. They have, by the time these young men enter the priesthood, they have not developed in society properly. They end up warped people. And he's starting to allude to that these priests have not been properly connecting with their societies, and there's some type of issue there. And you could go as far as saying priestly celibacy, but Francis won't be that open about it. So Francis, prior to April 2019, he has a meeting where he calls all of the key leaders of the Catholic Church across the world and conducts meetings on this sexual abuse crisis. And he starts to meet with the victims. And through those meetings, he starts to push this idea that it's because of this disconnect between priests and society. How is that different to the Catholic Church's position before? Because that's not the normal Catholic position on why these cases occur. What's Benedict's reasoning for why these sexual abuse cases happened? Sister at the back. Benedict doesn't say that. That's what John Paul said. Women are raped because of their own fault, essentially. Benedict doesn't name women particularly. Who does he blame? Because in the most largest percentage of cases, the victims are boys. Women are still abused, but the majority of the victims are young men. He blames a liberal mindset. So he states, sorry, do you want to add to that?
Also, I think I've read an article where he also the sexuality that takes place in the West. He also criticizes the Western secular culture that is subject also to immorality.
So he blames the liberalism, particularly of the West, and the sexual immorality that he saw rise, particularly in the 1960s and 70s. We talk about the 1960s and the sexual revolution. He blames all of that for the sexual abuse crisis within the Catholic Church. This is an article of The Guardian. It's The Guardian, April 20, 2019. It's titled One Church, Two Popes. So if you look up The Guardian, One Church, Two Popes. The crisis inside the Vatican. Why Catholicism is in crisis this Easter. In his pre-Easter address to pilgrims gathering in Rome, Pope Francis highlighted Jesus' words as he died on the cross on the first Good Friday. "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." We all, the Argentinian pontiff stressed, need to find the courage to forgive those who have wronged us. Those remarks sparked speculation about who exactly Francis was struggling to forgive. Top of most lists in Rome this Easter is his predecessor, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, who decided in 2013 to break with 600 years of work unto death, papal tradition, and retire. This opened Catholicism's door to the breath of fresh air that is Francis. So you can see how liberal news articles treat Francis. How do they like him? It's clear he's well supported. For the past 6 years, as the winds of change have blown through the church, Benedict has by and large kept a respectful silence, ignoring the ever louder pleas of traditional Catholics who want the 92-year-old to join them in opposing Francis's reform agenda. So conservative Catholics are not hiding. They're calling to Benedict to come out of retirement and oppose Francis. But he stayed quiet from 2013 to April 2019. When Benedict published a 6,000-word article in a German magazine. It made headlines by blaming the clerical abuse scandal on the moral relativism of the 1960s sexual revolution and the homosexual cliques that allowed this lawlessness to infect seminaries. It is a line of argument that directly, and conservative cardinals insist, pointedly contradict all of Francis's efforts, including a summit of world bishops in the Vatican in February, to tackle the damage done by pedophile priests by pointing the finger at a dominant culture within the church. A culture that encourages priests and bishops to operate as if they are above the moral guidelines they preach and regard themselves as beyond the sanction of civil courts. Pope Francis the Reformer is being challenged by his conservative predecessor, who now has a far-right backing, including Steve Bannon. But what Benedict's intervention and apparent rebuke of his successor mostly lays bare is how hard it is proving for an absolute monarchy like the Catholic Church to operate when it has not one but two living popes. Indeed, it explains why for 600 years papal retirement was regarded as not an option. The two of them represent opposite poles of Catholicism. So, wanting to call him Ratzinger. Benedict breaks his silence in early April 2019. Who else comes out in a study April 5, 2019? No. Elder Jeff. Now, he's supposed to have passed the mantle, yes? April 2019, Benedict releases this 6,000-word essay undermining his successor. April 2019, there's a camp meeting in Germany, and what does Elder Jeff do? What presentation was released at that camp meeting? Half right and half wrong. And what is he saying? What is he saying when he teaches half right, half wrong? Brother. When? 2012. So he's going to say that Elder Parminder was half right and half wrong. So at the same time, he's reinforcing that what he's already said, that Parminder is his successor, the second angel, the new leader of the movement. He's also completely undermines his position by saying that Parminder in the history, when he brought the message, was only half right and half of it was error. And we countered that. So in April you have that tension internally between those, and this is what really starts to divide people. Jeff's disciples from Parminder's disciples. People are unhappy with the position that we took against him. And you have these two factions. Within Catholicism, same month, you have these two factions as Benedict comes out of hiding and undermines Francis. That's in April of last year. We come down to September, October of last year, and the Amazon Synod. We spoke about how Pope Francis welcomed this delegation from the Amazon region. They brought these statues of pregnant women, and conservative Catholics were horrified. Quoting one cardinal, Cardinal Mueller, strong conservative. Pope Francis sacked him in 2017. He went on EWTN and said that the great mistake was for Francis to bring idols into the church in the first place. To throw the idols into the river, as a conservative Catholic again had done, may be against human law, but to bring the idols into the church in the first place was a grave sin, a crime against divine law. So what they're accusing Pope Francis of, what sin are they accusing Pope Francis of? Bringing idols into the church. What do we call that? Idolatry. They're accusing him of idolatry. The National Catholic Reporter answers back. So they are saying idolatry, abomination by Francis. National Catholic Reporter counters back. They do a four-part series on EWTN and accuse EWTN, at least in this instance, of racism. Quoting from the National Catholic Reporter. This is the National Catholic Reporter speaking about EWTN. They say, viewers who tuned into EWTN's News Nightly for news from a Catholic perspective were treated to two previously recorded one-on-one interviews by anchor Lauren Ashburn with Mike Pence and Sarah Huckabee Sanders. So in some of these, part of this four-part series is they break down the connection between EWTN and conservative Protestantism, particularly Trump's administration. So NCR is highlighting the connection between EWTN and the White House, Trump's administration. The segment was clear evidence of how a television outlet once devoted to expressions of Catholic piety and conservative catechists and apologetics has grown into a truly influential media empire, well connected to Republican politicians and the Trump White House. EWTN, where the Catholic perspective is unabashedly partisan, has become the media star in a web of connections, including wealthy conservative Catholic donors and some of the most public anti-Pope Francis forces in the Catholic world. Who created EWTN? Mother Angelica. Do we all know who she is? Does anyone not know who she is? Raise your hand if you don't know who Mother Angelica refers to. Okay. So when Elder Jeff split from this movement, he released a presentation explaining why he split. It was his first public statement since he made it clear he was separating from this movement. What was the title of that presentation? Finding Mother Angelica. Hiding Mother Angelica. Mother Angelica was a Catholic nun who founded EWTN. What Elder Jeff did was he said that Tess taught that in 1996 there's the formalization of a message, but also in this history you have two streams of information, two internal, two external. I say those two streams are CNN and Fox, symbolized by those titles. I say that CNN is good and Fox is bad. We all are familiar with that. What Elder Jeff says is that both Fox and CNN are bad. That they're both streams, two streams of the CNN, dragon, Fox, false prophet. So it's the dragon and the false prophet. And then in this first video, when he splits from this movement titled Hiding Mother Angelica, he claims that you can place EWTN here and that's the beast. So he says dragon, beast, false prophet. And these are the three information streams of the threefold union. So what I teach is that you have two streams of information. One is good for your agenda, one is bad for your agenda. So for a Nethinim at the end of the world, CNN is good, Fox is bad. For this movement, Time of the End magazine was good, Adventist leadership was bad. And we could go down that line. What he's saying is not that there's these two streams, one is correct and one is incorrect. He's saying that there are three streams, they're equally wicked, and they're the dragon of the information streams of the threefold union, dragon, beast, and false prophet. Does that make sense? Someone said no. Okay. I will try and draw our two positions. So this is the movement position. We teach that in every dispensation there are two streams of information. One stream is good, one stream is bad, and it's about choosing the good from the bad that is our test in that dispensation. So if you're in the dispensation of the ploughing, you have to choose the Time of the End magazine over your conference church pastor. Does that make sense? And then what we're saying is that if you're a Nethinim, you want to be on the right side at the end of the world, you have to choose CNN over Fox. Does that make sense? So we say two streams. And while you find them in every dispensation, it is the formalization of the message for the 144,000. So 1996 has a special place in that structure. And in 1996, we placed, just dealing with the external, not that we can do the internal, Time of the End magazine, church pastor, but just with the external, we say CNN and Fox. Fox News becomes the propaganda machine of the Republican Party and evangelical Protestantism. They become the stream that, if we use the Uli and the Hittikel, takes you to the lake of fire. CNN, not talking morally, they give the right message at the end of the world for the world. So CNN become good, and don't think morally, think prophetically, parabolically. CNN become good, Fox become bad. This is the information stream that they can ingest safely. This is the one that they cannot. But I also recognized that 1996, being the formalization of the message, you can place many things here. So you can place Yahoo News here. You can place Google. You can place Cryptome. Cryptome was the predecessor of WikiLeaks. It inspired Julian Assange to create WikiLeaks. Google's just a search engine, but all of these things you get placed in 1996 at the same time as the formalization of our message. It's a huge boom for these information streams. And I'm not trying to say that Cryptome is good or bad. It just fits in there. Not trying to say Google is good or bad. It just fits in there. Does that make sense? So it's not just Fox and CNN. They become a symbol of the Uli and the Hittikel, the good and the bad. There are these others that also develop in this important year. So this is what the movement teaches. What FFA teach, what Elder Jeff has fought for from the very beginning of the Midnight Cry, is that this is incorrect. This understanding is what has divided this movement. If you want to know why there's been this shaking, it is almost entirely, it all comes back to this issue here. Because Elder Jeff does not believe this. The day that November 9 was presented in Arkansas, October 3, 2019, we did not fight over November 9. He accepted that on the spot. But we stayed for about 2 hours and fought over this. He did not accept it, and he never would. So that was rejected from the very beginning of the Midnight Cry. What he teaches is that in 1996, you have CNN. It is the voice of the dragon. You have Fox, which is the voice of the false prophet. And you have EWTN, which is the voice of the beast. So he says that these three information streams are the voice for the threefold union. Does that make sense? What doesn't make sense about it? My brother. You said it doesn't make sense. What's the confusion? Mm-hmm. Sorry? Any logic to this? Yeah, neither do I. We're in agreement. The first thing I don't see logic to is CNN. How is that the voice of the United Nations? And Fox is the voice of America? CNN is created in America. It's a news platform for Americans, just as much as Fox is. So how can you say CNN is the voice of the United Nations? Who's influencing what CNN broadcasts? Because it's not Pakistan. It's not Uganda. It's not Russia. Russia's impacting this one. If you want to start saying that there's foreign interference, Russia's impacting what Fox presents. They're not impacting what CNN presents. What portion of the United Nations is speaking through CNN? That's the first part that makes us rely on conspiracy theories that are completely untenable. The second issue I have with this is EWTN. I'm happy to see that in some fashion that it can fit into here. Mind you, It was actually formed well before 1996. All they got in 1996 was a satellite dish. What's the problem with placing EWTN as the voice of the beast? Brother Dennis. Does it speak for Benedict or Francis? It speaks for Benedict. They are entirely against Pope Francis. So are they speaking for the papacy? No. Instead, you find we come down to this dispensation, and how many streams do you have internally? How many streams? You have 2. On one side, you have Parminder and myself. On the other side, you have Elder Jeff. You come down to here. I'll change that. The movement, FFA. Come down to the papacy, and how many streams do you have? 2. National Catholic Reporter and EWTN. So when Elder Jeff leaves this movement, he makes his first presentation on EWTN and says that that is proof that I am wrong about 2 streams of information. Instead of proving us wrong, he just proved it. Because what he identified was that there are 2 streams within the Catholic Church. It entirely fits our model. And in those particularly in the last months of 2019, this all blew into the open war between National Catholic Reporter, Liberal supporting Francis, and EWTN, Conservative supporting Benedict. These were the 2 media streams for the Catholic Church, and they were openly hostile to each other. Go on to National Catholic Reporter and look for that 4-part series. It won't be hard to find. Just put into Google the 4-part series by NCR, and it'll bring you to these 4 articles against EWTN. And it goes back and forth between them. But we also mentioned LifeSite News. I just want to read this article. It's October 22, 2019 by LifeSite News. It says, the Bishop of the Diocese of Xingu, Brazil, revealed in a new book that in his diocese, women are not only presiding over liturgies of the Word, but are also giving homilies, a practice contrary to Catholic rules. In his new publication, Bishop Krautler repeats his call for married priests and for female deacons, as well as for female priests. It is in this context that he speaks about the large role that women already play in the church in his own region in Brazil. When claiming that women have too little say in the Catholic Church, he states, Brazil, and perhaps also somewhere else, is at the most a tender flash of light. It is far from proof of the sunrise of these things, that the introducing of women priests and all of this, but he's convinced that the time will come. And he hopes that the Amazon Synod will break open new paths, make steps towards this direction. In 2014, he met with Pope Francis and explained his views. For this, then they go to an Austrian bishop, Don Philippe. He says that tradition has had a bad taste. He proposes to get rid of the ballast that has been accumulated over the centuries, which we in our church carry with much suffering, and which some in the right corner fanatically defend as tradition. So yesterday when we closed, we talked about the argument over dispensationalism. It's what divided this movement. Is what God says, instructions in one dispensation, in application, does that change in another dispensation? We've gone through that with diet, we've gone through that with racism, and the final straw for those that left was dealing with that with with sexism. Understanding the methodology of dispensationalism. And this fight between these liberal bishops and the conservative faction is all about how do you approach tradition? Is it eternal or is it dispensational? The Austrian prelate furthermore suggested that there have been many teachings, for example, of the 1800s that the church in the 20th century abandoned. For example, this is LifeSite News, this is a Catholic publication. He says, the church used to believe in some things, and what have they changed? The church's stance with regards to democracy. What did they used to believe about democracy? So the Catholic article is going to make the argument for dispensationalism, saying 200, 300 years ago, the Catholic Church was dead set against democracy and religious liberty, and also to other novelties introduced in the Second Vatican Council that would have been regarded as heretical at the time of the First Council. So they're saying we've already changed some of our beliefs based on dispensation. It's the same thing that we said. We don't eat fish, we don't practice slavery, because that was past dispensation and God is requiring different of us today. They make the argument 200 years ago we did not practice religious liberty and we would not permit democracy. EWTN says Pope Francis introduced an abomination into the Catholic Church. He promoted idolatry. National Catholic Reporter responded in their article, why don't those conservatives in EWTN look outside their windows and see the Egyptian obelisk in St. Peter's Square? They say, because these statues of these pregnant women, they were naked, this horrified the conservatives. NCR says, why don't they look at the roof of the Sistine Chapel? All the paintings of naked people. Remember the Philistines in earlier generations that wanted the nudes of the Sistine Chapel covered over. So they have this argument back and forth. We'll close now for time. But these are the two streams within the Catholic Church, and it's relevant for us to see when all of this breaks into the open. April 2019, internally, April 2019 with the counterfeit. Then we come to, we'll get into the history of October, September, October of 2019. This conflict with the Amazonian Synod, also splitting the church and causing Pope Benedict to write an article to contribute to a book just recently released that, in a more strong fashion than ever before, undermined his successor. Do we have any questions on what we've done so far?
Okay, the aspect in which the conservative Adventists, not Adventists, the Catholics, are viewing Francis, are they viewing him as a dictator in what he is doing?
Yes. They believe that Francis is a dictator. Depends how radical you go. Once you get down to church militant type of far right, they believe he's the Antichrist, the prophesied Antichrist of Revelation. But that he needs to be replaced by a conservative pope, cleanse the church.
So probably they may plan to overthrow him.
If you want to listen to a quite laborious to listen to book, but still interesting, there was a book, a conservative Catholic wrote a book on the 2014 Synod on the Family, and he titled it The Dictator Pope, saying that Pope Francis pretty much is establishing a dictatorship, not just because of what he's done on Synod on the Family, but also how he's been purging the Catholic Church of conservative enemies.
Yeah, so from this line, Pope Benedict's recents in 2013, and then in 2019, when Pope Francis is trying to bring this question of celibacy, I mean, it can allow, how do we call them? It can allow fathers from some areas, some remote areas to get married. That gets Pope Benedict from where I descended, he wants to come back and say we cannot allow them to marry. Is that the same scenario we have in the True Line? Because Jeff resigns. After he resigns, Aminta makes some reforms in the movement, and that gets Jeff out of retire to come and take and try to cover the reforms that the new leadership is making.
Just the compare and contrast Brother William has pointed out for us. Yes, I agree. When we come to the internal, we see that prior to November 9, we start saying things that are really quite radical. We're saying, bringing the argument of dispensationalism and equality, and this is what causes Elder Jeff to come out from retirement and to speak out publicly against what we're teaching. Same time, 2019, the final months, you have the Amazonian Synod. Everyone knows where Pope Francis is heading, the introduction of bringing in equality with women as far as allowing them in certain cases to perform certain functions, which everyone knows will lead to them being introduced into the priesthood, and also allowing married priests. And that causes Pope Benedict to come out of retirement, contribute to a book that's been recently released. But he wrote that book, he wrote his portions for that book, not this year, but in the September, October months of 2019. So it might not have been recognised until now, but that was happening at the same time as the internal shaking.
Just to add on that, just remember something that as a Pope was come out of power, like Benedict, there is a certain white garment they are supposed to wear, which is like a form of respect to the one who precedes him, and he is not allowed to speak anything against the one who was his predecessor. And I just found it interesting with Brother William's quote that Pope Benedict has just written 6,000 articles trying to criticize the rulership of Pope Francis, something that he is not allowed to do. So it's like a dead man speaking. The same thing, when Jeff comes back to speak against the new reforms, something he is not allowed to do, trying to undermine the predecessor.
So Brother Dennis just highlighting,
Successor.
I knew what you meant. Brother Dennis is just highlighting how it's not permitted for Pope Benedict to speak out against his successor, how he's supposed to wear the white garment that shows his respect and submission to the new Pope. He's not actually permitted, and I think, Brother Dennis, you used the term dead man talking. He's not supposed to interfere with the actions of his successor. That's essentially illegal, not permitted. And yet we have the same in the internal. We have he who symbolically, he ended in 2014. This is marking the death of the first angel in our history of success, the line of Christ. And yet we come up to this history, and where he is not permitted to be speaking against this movement, we find that he does. So the compare and the contrast works neatly, particularly from 2014 through 2019. You find this transition in 14 and 13, but the restructuring Francis does in 14. This division between these two sides, the disciples of Jeff, the disciples of Parminda, the disciples of Benedict, the disciples of Francis. The disciples of Benedict saying, please come out of retirement, please sort out this mess. The disciples of Jeff were not so subtly saying the same thing. We come to April, counterfeited, end this movement. Elder Jeff speaks, Pope Benedict speaks. Later months of 2019, it's open conflict between two streams of information. Open conflict between this movement and FFA, open war between NCR and EWTN, and the Conservatives again looking to Benedict. Elder Jeff starts speaking in the final months of 2019. Pope Benedict starts writing in the final months of 2019, both undermining the changes of their successor, that book only released in the last couple of weeks that Benedict was writing in that time period. Title of the book? Does anyone know the title of the book? I don't think so. From the depths of our hearts. So if you're looking for it, it's called From the Depths of Our Hearts. It argues in favour of centuries-old tradition of priestly celibacy within the church. In other words, priestly celibacy is not dispensational. Same argument. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. We see how you have led and guided, not just in these last 5 years, Lord, which have been of such significance, but also in the centuries that have led us to this point. We see, Father, that you have acted with love and compassion to restore your people. We see the ugliness of the counterfeit of this work. We appreciate you. I pray, Lord, that we might understand both more clearly, that none of us should be deceived. Lord, we know these issues are stirring up within the movement, conflict over what these things mean, what we bring to the Nethinims, what we require of them, what is required of us. I pray, Lord, you give us greater clarity on these issues. May none of us be deceived. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.